recently had to renew my passport, and it was a very stressful experience. My dad was over while I was filling out the forms, and he asked me, "What are you going to put down for occupation?" I mustered up some conviction and said, "Writer." To his credit, he didn't say anything. I think he's given up on trying to convince me into a real job at this point. But it has taken me a very long time to embrace I am a writer. See, I come from a traditional Indian family, and creative work is a hobby, not a career for us. My family immigrated to the US when I was 10, and my parents were well into their 40s, so they view careers and stability from a very different lens. Writer is an intimidating label to take on, especially in the South Asian community, but even talking about it here today with you makes me really nervous. But this is part of my journey of self-acceptance and belonging. I share it with you in hopes of having you view your own choices in a different light. Now, if you'd met me a few years ago, I was the perfect Indian kid, like Steve mentioned. I had a good corporate job, condo, car, I graduated from a great college, and as an immigrant, that was success. I was living the American dream. But inwardly, I felt really unhappy. I didn't have a lot of friends. I felt like I didn't belong in my own skin, like I was an outsider looking in on my life. My mom, being a classic Indian mom, would say, "It's just time for you to get married, you'll feel better then." As if dragging another person into my unhappiness would solve all my problems. I passed on the arranged marriage. Instead, I saved and decided to take a break from the corporate world and figure out why I felt so deeply disillusioned. I also wanted to work on a novel I couldn't stop thinking about. When I decided to quit, the people in my life thought I was crazy and were very vocal about it. My dad wrote me an email saying, quitting that job would be the biggest mistake of my life, almost verbatim. A very close friend asked, "Don't you want to be a contributing member of society?" As if implementing healthcare software was the only way for me to do so. But I didn't care what anyone else said. I wanted to write the novel. So I packed up my little car and I drove from LA to Madison, Wisconsin, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the narratives that were being imposed on me. Narratives around what it means to be successful as a woman, a professional, an Indian, a member of society. I needed space to think and choose what I wanted to do, who I wanted to be. So I ended up in Madison in the middle of a lot of snow and nothing else. I was staying in a bare condo, sleeping on the floor. I had a few books with me and no Wi-Fi. I just focused on the novel. I look back at those 4 months now and realize what I was also doing was accessing my inner self and reflecting. What that often looked like was me laying on the floor, feeling a lot of emotions and crying a lot. But I was starting to understand why I felt like I didn't belong. A core issue, I'm sure you can relate to this, was I had allowed my job to be my core identity, and I had no sense of belonging outside of work. The symptoms were obvious in my personal life. I wasn't very close to my family back then. I was 26 and had never been in a significant relationship. I had very few honest, meaningful friendships. I realized I didn't know how to connect with people. Some of us are just naturally great at building connections, at opening up, and some of us, like me, need a bit more guidance. Unfortunately, there's no class about that in college, and I grew up in a house where we were taught emotions are a weakness. I remember being 7 years old and my dad saying, "If you need to cry, go do it in the bathroom." We were raised tough, and I learned very young to compartmentalize my feelings and never, ever impose them on someone else. I wasn't even open with myself, let alone other people. No wonder I felt so disconnected. I had too many walls up, and how was I ever going to belong? So the big question is, how do you convince yourself that you belong? Not intellectually, but in your being. For me, forget about belonging outside of work. I didn't even feel like I belonged at work, something I'd made such a large part of my identity. I'd climbed the corporate ladder pretty quickly. I was usually the youngest person in the room, one of few women, and often the only woman of color. The imposter syndrome was overwhelming. I worked twice as hard to convince myself and others that I belonged, that I deserved a seat at that table, and to do so, I put on whatever mask was necessary to fit in. It took me a long time to realize I didn't even want to be at that table. I've done a lot of research around belonging since then, and Brené Brown's work is profound to me. She talks about how fitting in is the opposite of belonging. Because when you try to fit in, you're discarding your true self and you're replacing it with what you think other people will find more accepting. It's a mask, it's a huge problem. I had smothered my creativity and sensitivity for a large part of my life at home, and I was trying to fit into these jobs that also had no space for those things. So there in Madison, I realized all of my choices were the opposite of belonging. I needed core connections and creativity. But ultimately, I failed at the writing bit there. I finished the first draft, and the daunting task of editing was too much for me. The idea that this pursuit was going to ruin my career took over. I had just gotten good at that job, and I was in a leadership role, and had thrown all of that away for what? What if my dad was right, and I had made the biggest mistake of my life? Despite all the smiles, I allowed other people's opinions to creep in. I gave up on the novel. I came back to LA, and I did pursue more passionate work that I've found more meaningful, and I was working too many hours again, adopting new identities. I stopped writing altogether. The novel felt like a failed, far-fetched dream. My reintroduction to writing was a bit dramatic and cheesy, kind of like me. About a year and a half ago, I got sick. I had rashes, I couldn't really walk, and doctors struggled to find a diagnosis for a number of weeks. And then when they did, it turns out there were only 9 other documented cases, so it took them a while longer to figure out a course of action. I went and stayed with my parents. I felt really helpless. All I could really do was wait and think. I was thinking about my mortality for the first time ever. I was wondering, am I living the kind of life that I want to live? Had I given up on writing because of practicality or fear? The work I was doing was rewarding, but not completely fulfilling. I was being more open with friends, but if I was being very honest with myself, I had liked a man for quite a while, but I hadn't admitted it. So much for being open. That was my life is too short moment. The problem turned out to be a bacterial infection, and after 2 courses of antibiotics, I was okay. But it was time to brave up. First, with the guy situation. I knew that I wouldn't be able to express myself in person, just old habits. So I wrote him an email about how I felt about our friendship and him. Classic modern-day love letter. Now, I wish I could tell you that we lived happily ever after, but he did not feel the same way about me, and I was pretty devastated. But the email had allowed me to access and express my emotions on a whole different level. And it had been kind of fun. I'd done too many edits on it, but it was kind of poetic and very different from my sci-fi writing style. So I began writing again. And this time I shared online to hold myself accountable. And the daily habit immediately made me happier. I wasn't trying to fit into a box of writer, like that is, the extreme Madison escape. But writing and sharing wasn't easy. And a year later, it's still not. In the beginning, my mom was like, what are all these feelings you're putting online? What are people going to say? Even now, when people in my real life find my Instagram, I can sometimes sense some judgment. It's kind of awkward. There's always comments. But I didn't let other people's opinions stop me this time. I was addressing my heartbreak, disappointments, hopes, dreams. I was owning my own narrative, and I belonged to myself again. I started a new book. This time, I actually finished it. I'm now working with my dream publisher, and they are going to be publishing my book in a couple of months. And it feels Really unreal. Thank you. Thank you. It's very unreal. But none of that would have happened if I'd allowed other people's opinions and doubts to creep in again. When you stop putting on a mask and start being true to yourself, you open yourself up to new possibilities. You begin to have faith in yourself because you recognize your uniqueness rather than the sameness of fitting in. When you belong to yourself, you can live a bit more passionately, with a bit more kindness and a sense of purpose. It takes a lot of courage to be yourself in a world telling you all the things that you should be. I meet a lot of people that say, someday I'm gonna quit my miserable job too. Someday I'll make art or start my side business. But they're afraid. They're afraid of failure or disappointing their friends or families. They're worried about what other people will say. I get it, I've been there. It's scary. But at the end of the day, you have to choose how to live life on your own terms, rather than try to fit into an imposed narrative. So I'd like you to think about this question today and every day. Do you belong to yourself? Are you sitting at the right table? If not, what are you going to do about it? Thank you.